Good afternoon and welcome to Byte. What are the next generation pricing models for eDiscovery? I am pleased to announce our esteemed panel today of Joe Sherman, CEO and founder of eDT, Mike Quartararo, CEO and founder of eDPM, and Tom O'Connor, the founder and director of Gulf Coast Legal Technology Center. And I am Gail O'Connor, your moderator. I do marketing work with eDT, and if you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please feel free to add them to the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. Or if we feel they're really prevalent for what we're talking about at the moment, we'll go ahead and try and address them at that time. So without further ado, let's get started. First, I want to play you a little clip that will kind of, I think, give you the idea of where we are in presenting this today.
I'm mad as hell! How am I not take this anymore?
I'm mad as hell! I'm not gonna take it anymore! I'm mad as hell! I'm not gonna take it anymore!
I'm mad as hell! I'm not gonna take it anymore!
I'm mad as hell and I'm not gonna
take it anymore!
I'm mad as hell! I'm mad as hell!
Well, I think you get the idea. We are mad as hell, and we aren't not going to take this anymore. So let's talk about how we got here. We're going to talk about why we're stuck here, and then we're going to talk about new options. So I think I'm going to throw this to Tom first. Tom, how did we get here?
Thanks, Gail. Well, it's an interesting quandary, and I think it's important to remember that it's sort of a natural evolution. It's, you know, although it may feel awkward now, how we got here is really a legacy of how we started in litigation support, which many years ago was with paper. Static images that we copied and threw a Bates label on and copied them again, the old copy label copy. And so there was a thought in a paradigm, if you will, in the litigation support world that was based on a per page, a per unit pricing. And then as we evolved into imaging, that didn't really change. We went from copies of paper to images of the documents, and that transferred from a per page to a per image, if you will, which translated into gigabytes. And the storage then sort of followed the same model. Instead of being stored, paper being stored in boxes and thrown up on a shelf and paying somebody either a square foot charge in your office or a per month charge for a storage company, we paid by the gigabyte again for that online access to the data. Or of course we paid per gigabyte by buying our own servers and hooking that up, and the additional costs of support staff and maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. And then for the software, we also would pay a user access fee, a per user. So we, as everybody knows, we're paying per gigabyte per month, per user per month, and then sometimes some other charges for other services, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But the point is, this was really kind of natural, and there were a lot of different people doing this. You know, we part of the problem we have now is we don't have as many vendors as we had 20, 25 years ago. In preparing to this, I pulled out one of the books I've always turned to in the past, Litigation Support Systems, by Ron Stout, who was professor at Chicago Kent School of Law. He was actually, when he wrote the book, he was working at Lexis on some projects, and his co-author was Jim Kane. who was a well-known consultant at the time. Jim had worked at a number of companies. He started off working for the Maryland Attorney General, and then went to Cooper's Lybrand, and then eventually Arthur Young, the predecessor of Ernst & Young. And looking through that, I was quite surprised to see the number of products. They talked about over 20 different products, you know, most of which have come and gone. Ipso Facto, Key File, Discovery Base, Zyindex, Folio Views, InMagic. The big companies like Quorum and Khaki and Atlas and Aspen all had products. And of course, we had the two giants of the business, Summation and Concordance. But they all followed that same sort of model. Since then, and that book was written, I think the first version was maybe 1999, 2000. There were several updates to that over the next few years. But that model followed for what we followed for quite some time. But in the last 5, 6, 7 years, things have changed. We've had an explosion of data types. We're no longer dealing with just images of static, either word processing documents or email. We've got tons of document types now, from HTML to data off of IoT devices. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the vast number of data types that we're dealing with. At the same time, prices dropped. Hardware prices dropped, as always in technology. So it became cheaper to just save everything, which sort of reinforced that per gigabyte model. It didn't behoove anybody to delve into material because it was just as easy to save it. But then the federal rules, and of course later some of the state rules changed, and the duty to preserve, which flowed out of the common law duty not to destroy evidence, came before the case was even filed, when you had a reasonable anticipation of litigation. And so the whole onus of when you had to start working with this data changed to become very, very early in the game. And then finally, we've gotten now newer technology. We've got technology that allows us to index and search and retrieve much, much faster than we were ever able to in the past, which is good because we have so much data. We've got all sorts of new technologies like predictive coding and TAR, and we'll talk about some of these as we go. But the fact is that the technology has gone beyond simple keyword searching into a vast new world of document search, retrieval, and indexing, much of it done by computers themselves. And of course, now we've got web storage. We don't have to pay somebody to put the information on another computer or buy hardware to put it on our computers. We can pay people to put it up into the web. So things have changed rather dramatically to move us in, and I think it's important to remember that this is an ongoing process. We're dealing with things that are changing in sort of a natural evolutionary state, like all technology. When trains came in, they didn't start right away in dominating transportation. The telegraph, the telephone, even when we moved to cars. In our own world recently, faxes and the use of the internet. None of these came in a week or 2 weeks. They had to disrupt the technology that preceded it and existed. And I think that's where we are right now. We're in an ongoing natural evolution of transition. And I think we'll talk about some really good reasons why we should, or you should engage in that transition and evolve into these new ways of handling this new paradigm, if you will. So that's my spiel on how we got here.
And so, Mike, do clients really not understand the cost?
Yeah, and continuing the theme of how we got here, I think it's a really good starting point, because I think from the very beginning, clients struggle to understand the costs. And that's really a double-edged sword if you think about it, because it's not necessarily that, clients aren't interested in what they're paying for. And it's not like, I guess you could probably make the case that in some cases, there's been a lack of transparency and insight. But at the end of the day, if you go to the store and you buy something, it's on you to understand what it is you're buying. And so it really comes back to the clients who are footing the bill for most of these things. And to be perfectly honest, I've built an entire career on explaining to clients, and as you'll see from the very next slide, to lawyers, that this is the job that we're appointed to do, to help them to understand the cost. And I'm reminded of something that, and I think the attribution goes to Craig Ball, but I'm reminded that we all have to keep in mind that eDiscovery starts with those who don't understand the technology, and it ends with technologists who don't necessarily understand the law. So you've got this sort of, from the outset, this sort of competing concept of what is the cost, how do you explain the cost, what is the technology, how do you explain the technology. All these kinds of questions are just sort of hang out there, and folks who have been fortunate to work where I've worked, and I know many of the people on the webinar today would likely say that they have made their careers out of helping clients to understand the cost, and that's part of what we do. The answer to your question, Gail, is yes. They don't always understand the costs, and I think it's gotten better over time, and as the technology becomes easier to use and easier to understand. But every time I think that we've got it all figured out, things like machine learning come along and really throw the clients and the litigators for a loop. These sort of black box technologies are not easy to explain, and it's not even a question of whether they're easy to explain or not. It's a question of does the lawyer or the ultimate client who's paying the bill, do they even really want to understand it? And sometimes lawyers are busy people and they don't have time to get into the weeds on it, and that's why we exist. That's why folks like me and Tom and Joe exist, because we're there to fill in that gap. So yeah, that's some of why we're here as well.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to pass it to Joe now with what is it about per gigabyte pricing that is, how I say, deficient, for lack of a better word?
Sure. I think the point that I wanted to make, Gail, is that I think it's great to look back into the history of the evolution of pricing and litigation support, and now eDiscovery. And a lot of us can really understand where that's come from. But I think what we need to do now is actually really rethink, just challenge these norms and these models that we're just, I think, blindly accepting. I think it's time to say, look, the emperor has no clothes. Let's take a look at this. Per gig pricing is flawed because it's out of sync with sound pricing principles and foundational concepts in terms of effective pricing. I'm not a pricing theorist. There are many pricing theorists and philosophers even out there that can talk in much greater depth than I can about pricing, but the research that I've done suggests that there are three very prominent methodologies that you could apply when pricing a product or a service, and each of them has merit. And I think when we look at these philosophies, we can sort of challenge our own models against them. Value-based pricing is, of course, what is the customer perspective? How does the client, the end customer, the person paying the bill, ultimately value what they're receiving? And that's a measure that we could use to price a product or a service. That's pricing that is often very effective and readily available in an emerging new market where there aren't many competitors, and there's often a nice opportunity for margin while also not compromising on value and client perceptions of effective, valuable delivery. So that's sort of one model. Value-based charging can be a very effective way to go. Another approach, of course, is cost-based charging. So that's cost plus margin. And the third one, competitor-based pricing, I'm mentioning together because I think those two approaches together represent a pricing that evolves in a more mature market, such as the eDiscovery sector that we're all working in. And that's where it starts to become more commoditized. So there are more competitors, more commoditized pricing, lower margins get squeezed, and to some extent, depending upon where you or your organization sits in the value chain or in the supply chain, margins are getting squeezed. So there's a great quote that one of my friends, an ex-Wall Street guy, actually said, we lose money on that particular product price, but we make it up in volume. And I love the irony and the sort of sarcasm in that, but I sometimes wonder whether that is something that is resonating for a lot of eDiscovery vendors, perhaps, particularly the service providers that are kind of in the middle of the supply chain. And it's certainly a bit of a challenged model. The other thing that I think is broken that we really need to think carefully about is the fact that if we base pricing on data volumes, then we as vendors or service providers are rewarding ourselves in a model that is entirely inconsistent with what the client perceives to be valuable or high value. So clients are generally trying to whittle down the volumes, whittle it down to the relevant core material that they need to effectively go in and fight the dispute. So it's about volume reduction. That's ultimately what they want. But if our costing model is rewarding us for volume increases, then there's obviously some serious conflict there, and the model is broken.
Joe, I did get a question just come in that says how important is it to focus on predictive pricing when it comes to quoting clients for eDiscovery services?
Well, in my experience, it's incredibly important. In fact, many clients will tolerate higher pricing in return for predictability. Simplicity and predictability. Simplicity is so important. So many bills that clients see in the eDiscovery sector incorporate so many unit-based components that it's incredibly complicated. I think there's a real move away from that towards simple, predictable pricing.
Great. And Joe, you're going to speak to us on this as well?
Yeah, I guess just another thought I guess I wanted to share is that I know that a lot of people that are attending this webinar will have had similar experiences to me and my company. Just for those that don't know, EDT is a software company. We don't do services, we don't do hosting, we don't do, we don't do consulting services necessarily. We just develop software, eDiscovery software. And in that context, we often find ourselves responding to RFPs, requests for proposals, requests for quotes. And it's really interesting and a little disappointing, actually, that so often in responding to these opportunities, we're very constrained in terms of the pricing model that is presented to us. And there's almost an assumption by the client in fact, there is usually an assumption by the client that they have no other option but to go down the per gig price model. And when you look at the pricing templates that are given to you, it's very clear also that there's not a lot of analysis necessarily that has gone into the definition of what is a gig. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. You know, are we talking about expanded data on disk under management? Or are we talking about source data? Are we talking about processed data ingested? Are we talking about produced data? Are we talking about data hosting? A gig is not a gig is not a gig. So as soon as you start getting into gig-based pricing, a whole world of complexity is introduced. And I guess my thought, if I could put it out there into the universe, is to say, don't limit yourself when you go to market by structuring your pricing model around a constrained scenario.
Great. And Michael.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here a little bit too and tag on to a little bit of what Joe said, because I think there is a valid point. I think more than anything, what buyers of eDiscovery services want is some predictability. They want to understand what they're paying and what they're getting for what they're paying. And it's about value. And I don't think anybody's saying that, you know, a provider or a software company or whoever in our space, I don't think anybody's saying that, you know, sorry, you're not entitled to make any money. That's not what anybody's saying. Everybody understands that, you know, companies exist to make money. That is what they do. The idea is more around understanding what that is. I think that eDiscovery professionals do know that many clients, many law firms are paying too much. And I'm going to go back down sort of the historical trail for a minute here, because I wrote a piece probably a month or two ago about the cost of a gigabyte when I started in this business. And, you know, we were paying $2,500 a gigabyte. Think about that for a minute. A 10 gig project, which is nothing today, would cost $25,000. 100 gigs, $250K. A terabyte sized project would cost $2.5 million based on pricing many years ago. Now, in many ways, some people will argue that, you know, we're sort of in this race to the bottom, right, with all the consolidation. It's interesting, though, that you can get processing at a per gigabyte rate for, you know, south of $25, depending upon what else is involved in the project, and there's a whole number of variables that go into it. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really questions that we're paying too much. What bugs me most, and what I see most in my consulting practice, is, you know, I'll be talking to an organization about what something's going to cost, you know, knowing some of the variables that are involved, and I'll see that they've gone out and reached out to vendors and done these RFP things, and this is a complete turnaround for me, but I'm happy to say that, you know, the RFP, I think years ago, was a valuable tool. I don't know that it's as valuable anymore because things have changed so much. The clients tend to get yourself boxed in when you do those RFPs, because you're asking questions in a certain way, and the respondent to the RFP is sort of forced to answer the question asked, and when you're doing these, and I've done plenty of them, you don't necessarily want to give the information that's going to not get you the job, right? So it's kind of a slippery slope to go down. Nonetheless, it still happens, and I'm sure it still works for some, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, when I'm sitting in front of a client who's telling me, yeah, we're about to pay this, that, or the other thing, and I say, gee, I wish you would have asked me first. I could have explored some other alternatives. There are those out there who are exploring alternative pricing models, and we're going to get into that a little bit. But I don't know, Tom, what do you think? The eDiscovery professionals know that they're paying too much?
Well, I think if you're talking about the IT people, certainly. Joe's going to talk about some of the different models that we're seeing now, but storage costs, as I mentioned earlier, have dropped off the table in the last 4 or 5 years for several different reasons that we don't need to get into. But anybody who works in the IT field and follows those sorts of things knows that and kind of scratches their head. Likewise, and it's a point I was going to turn to later on, we have, because of the growth of the models that we've had, segregated, if you will, different steps of the process. You referred to processing, but things like processing and moving data in and out, and then analytics and TAR, productions. Those were often separate pieces of the puzzle, and people were charged separately for those. Now we have solutions where we can be all inclusive. We don't have to charge separately for those, and we shouldn't expect that. But as you said, Mike, if you look at an RFP that includes that old style of pricing, it's hard to talk to people and say, wait a minute, we can do this differently. I think that's one of the struggles we face. A lot of times those RFPs are that way because well, that's what we've been doing for the last 4 years. Now we want a new price, and the only reference I have is the way we've always done it. So it's a difficult transition.
Yeah, and it's further complicated by things like really trying to understand whether per gig charges, how do they relate to real cost, and you say to someone, hey, here's 100 gigs of data, we're going to run it through the software. Well, nobody really understands what it took to develop that piece of software, what the R&D was for that, what the development cost was, frankly. So, you've got this piece of software, and whether you're the owner of it or you're licensing it, that's all part of the value equation, right? And per gig charging models really don't equate to real cost, or at least don't give full transparency into real cost.
Right.
Mike, you're reminding me of an analogy which I think is a really potent one, and that is that one of our eDiscovery colleagues once responded to a lawyer that was sort of complaining about the pricing, and the comment was made somewhere in the discussion around per gig pricing, and I think the lawyer said, well, that's like me charging per page for my advice rather than for the advice that's written on the page. Don't charge on the medium. How much are we devaluing our profession, our education, our expertise, our capability by reducing our value proposition to something that Google offers at less than a cent?
Yeah, and I've had lawyers say to me, lawyers are pretty smart people, generally speaking, and so they'll say to me things like, wait a minute, the software is sitting on a server, you're running this data through it, there's not even really a human touching the data, right? Of course there's some ingestion and there's some human involvement, but it's just sort of running through the software. It's what we would call machine time, right? So what's the price? What's the price of machine time, right? And it really comes back to this whole concept of the value of the investment that you're making in the software, the infrastructure. Yeah, there's some people costs in there as well, but we really need to get to a point where we understand what exactly those costs are, so we could level the playing field and everybody could really understand what they're paying for.
Sure.
So Joe, talk to us about some typical charges.
Yeah, this is just a little slide I put together just based on a random survey of about 5 or 6 colleagues, litigation support managers from a couple of different jurisdictions, I think 2 or 3 in the US, a couple in Canada, and 1 in Australia, 1 in the UK. And generally, ballpark, the response was that it's pretty common now to pay around $8 a gig per month for a case that has something like 500 gigs of data being hosted, about $100 per month per user for user fees, and processing varies significantly, ranging from 50 bucks a gig through to 150, depending upon the options that are made available. So this obviously 217. Some people will look at that and say, well, that's not much at all. We have multi-billion-dollar cases, and it's nothing. But the fact is that more and more cases have at least half a terabyte these days, and there are lots of cases that don't have that have a value that's in dispute that is really disproportionate to these costs. So going back to the good old the P word, proportionality. How do we actually make this work? And I think more interestingly, maybe if you go to the next slide, Gail. Not only have we got this value issue in the hands of the customer, but in the hands of the supply chain, might be the service provider, for example, that is using third-party software and might be in a situation where they really have no option but to pass those software costs onto the client, the software costs that they're passing through can be as much as the representation there, which is quite a high percentage of the total bill, which leaves very little room for margin. It might be that the additional costs relate to some infrastructure if they're providing and amortizing their own infrastructure, or some processing fees that might relate to some people fees. But as you can see, it's not a particularly attractive business proposition for service providers. So, the challenge for them is, what's our new model? Where is our value add in this supply chain? And how do we deal with the fact that, and you can go to the next slide now, Gail, how do we, more importantly, deal with the fact that our clients are going online and looking at per gig rates and sort of quoting them at us as comparatives to our pricing models. So these are the challenges, and I suppose I'm stating the obvious, but it would be interesting to hear other views on this. And it might be that people have questions in terms of the people that have signed up to participate. Gail, I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point, but Tom or Mike, did you want to sort of throw 2 cents in?
Well, this is, I alluded to a little bit about this at the beginning, that prices, especially storage prices, have just dropped off the table. And this is where we get a lot of questions. Wait a minute, how can you charge me this for something I can get for such a low price, for $10 a month? Now, of course, part of the answer to that is sure, but you have to stand that up in terms of support. You still have to be able to work with it and have somebody in your organization load it and help with searching. And that's something that our company can do for you, my service can do for you, whatever. But still, the fact of the matter is there's a huge disconnect between what people are seeing as the pricing for data storage these days and the pricing that's going on in the market. And that's the pressure that's forcing pricing down. And it's not just the data storage. As a result, some companies will say, well, we'll drop the user price. We'll adjust some of the other prices in an attempt to make that up somehow. So it just leads to all this, if you will, bickering really more over price on the component instead of what the individual asked earlier. Can't you just give me a predictive price about what this matter is going to cost me? Because that just is more of a business value.
Yeah, it seems to be, that the crux of the problem is that we as a sector, as a profession, as a community, are constantly linking our offering to a low value artifact that is available as a commodity on the open market through so many different sources. So we've got to stop talking about gigs and start talking about the value that we're bringing to the problem domain.
Absolutely.
Oh, the chat, here we go. We've got people on chat there. Gail, have we got some questions?
I don't see a question.
I can read it from Luke Smith. The rates between most providers are becoming so aligned. Seems like some competition authorities need to raid some providers and disrupt the market pricing. I think it's fair comment, Luke, and I think it's because there's a little bit of a squeeze. And going back to that earlier slide, some vendors really have little choice because they're being forced to pass software costs onto their clients that are not flexible at all. So that's where I talk about, the race to the bottom, because there's just no room for margin, but the clients are complaining. So it's not a happy domain.
I've got another comment. Are the providers getting more benefits from their data centers space so that the hosting is not as much or user fees? I work for a large law firm, and it seems like providers are throwing deals at us right and left.
Yeah, I think that's what I was alluding to a moment ago, that different vendors are attempting to manipulate some of those prices to come out at to maximize their profit, if you will, which is understandable. You know, as Mike said earlier, businesses are in business to make money, and we understand that. And so you are getting these deals left and right. Unfortunately, I think for the overall perspective, sometimes those deals are the ones that Joe mentioned in her analogy. You know, they're if not losing money, they're on razor thin margins. The solution, it seems to me, is better tools that coordinate or consolidate the different tasks that you need to do, as I mentioned. And you need to find companies or consultants who understand that and that can give you a better tool set and a more effective and efficient tool set. And that's part of the progression away from these gigabyte priced, not just models, but tools. The software was developed with that in mind, and I think we need to get away from it.
I think I better keep moving forward. I've got a couple questions coming in that I'm going to hold till the end. And Michael, I think you're going to talk to us about cloud provider costs.
Yeah, so the point we were trying to make here is, has anybody actually taken a look at what cloud storage costs? And I was forced to do this a couple of years back, and was in the midst of negotiating a move to the cloud for a particular product, and you know, it just kind of struck me as kind of shocking, frankly, that, you know, what some providers want to charge for storage is not, you know, sort of correlated to what you can go on the open market and buy yourself. And so that's what we're really trying to demonstrate here, that you can, you know, look, I firmly believe, and I hope, I don't know if I'll be proven wrong, but I think everything eventually moves to the cloud, right? Particularly in institutions like law firms. Law firms are not technology companies. They're not going to continue to invest in the, you know, millions of dollars in infrastructure, and it just makes sense. And, you know, corporations with their budgets and same thing. I think that eventually a lot of what we're doing on premises today moves to the cloud, and you're seeing it already. You're seeing the providers pop up there. You're seeing the cloud applications. You're seeing the infrastructure services that are out there. So it really does come down to, what are you paying for storage in the cloud? And, you know, the per gig pricing has dropped to a point where it's pretty navigable. And so now the question is, what are you paying for storage? And the point we were trying to make here is that, you know, storage is relatively cheap, and depending upon what your setup is, what you've got going on in the background, who's upgrading, who's maintaining, who's, you know, do you need those people costs, or you're paying somebody for those people costs? You know, there's a couple of different variables there, but all we really wanted to illustrate here, to sort of juxtapose to some of the conversation we had earlier, is, you know, here's what storage is costing, you know, the sort of typical user. I don't know if Joe or Tom want to add anything here, or are we running short on time, Gail?
Yeah, real quick though, one of our attendees asked, do you sense there's more pushback from clients due to cloud provider costs?
I think so. I think clients are informed. Clients can get access to this sort of data, and they're asking the question, why am I paying per gig 1,000 times more than what I perceive to be the same product through Dropbox or Microsoft OneDrive? The answer is, we have to stop pricing our offering on that metric, or we will continue to be devalued in the hands of our clients.
Yep. And along the same discussion, real quick, isn't there a problem with one large eDiscovery tool that starts with an R? Is that they are more expensive than the other tools, and some of the other companies are able to be more nimble with their price?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I don't think it's necessarily the company. I think that the larger companies, the more established companies who've been around and have a large client base, actually can be nimble with price if they choose to be. The problem is not so much them, and we saw this 12, 14 years ago with some other products as well. It's the channel. They're resellers, if you will, who sign contracts that are for 2, 3, 4 years at a specific price, then the market undercuts that price, so that the newer entrants to the market are able to undercut that sort of pricing. The point is, you have to be able to be nimble. You have to be able to move quickly, and locking yourself into long-term deals, whether you're a reseller or a client, in this world, in the world of technology today, it's going to come back and bite you in the gigabyte.
Jack be nimble, Jock be quick.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't think it's that particular company per se. I think it's the model.
All right. Joe, so if we start over, what are the alternatives?
Sure. Well, I can share some ideas, some thoughts, some observations in terms of what's happening in the market, not just in terms of our own approach to pricing at EDT, but also some models that I've seen working in the service provider domain, which is, through some of our partners that are taking to their clients, law firms, corporations, government agencies, some really different models that have been very effective. And it's great to be partnering with firms like that who are prepared to push back on the craziness of gig-based pricing. So I don't know if you can progress the slide there, Gail. I think I might have some prompts there on the next slide. So, I'm not suggesting that all of these things work in all cases, but these are some approaches that have been have started to emerge. Interestingly, some providers, particularly large service providers, are starting to charge again for that model of reviewed documents rather than sort of for hosting or processing. They're going back to that sort of fundamental principle that the biggest cost in eDiscovery is still actually document review, unless you're using TAR or some advanced analytics to do a more effective process, which we can touch on later. But if you're doing a lot of manual review, then there is an emerging trend towards a rate per reviewed document, and this works particularly well for those firms that have bundled their review teams with their processing and hosting capabilities. So they're kind of absorbing the hosting and processing costs, including software and infrastructure. Just an option to ponder. Infrastructure as a service is becoming more and more popular, and some infrastructure providers that have made big investments in their own infrastructure are taking on almost a wholesale scenario with large software companies, and then offering a retail offering to law firms and other clients, and effectively sort of wrapping up the pricing in a different way. Putting the margin where it belongs is, I guess, an idea that, or a concept that I think is really important. And I just going back to the fact that the gig-based storage is not where the costs are. At the end of the day, if you go right back through the supply chain, right back to the infrastructure costs, that's not where the costs are. It might be that your software provider is charging on that basis, but at the end of the day, storage is not the real cost. In the cloud, a much bigger cost than storage is actually compute. So when we work with our service provider partners to help them price for their clients, the most important question is not how much data or how many registered users do you have, but how many people are going to be hitting this at once, and what's their review rate, because that enables us to work with our partners to calculate their compute costs, which then can be wrapped up as the cost-based structure onto which a very reasonable margin can be applied. And that, I think, is a very fair way to price. It ends up being exponentially less expensive than the sorts of rates that people are used to paying in the market, and it is totally fair because it is real cost plus margin delivering perceived value. Another model is free processing. You were starting to see that in terms of large-scale projects. Some companies are bundling in free processing in return for long-term tenure. But I think all of this is about clients really understanding that they're in the driving seat. That is the end client, be it a corporation or a government agency, but also service providers. It's not a problem to push back and say, as we indicated in the video at the beginning, you know, I'm just not going to take it anymore. I want a new model, and I will find an option to take new pricing to the market.
Well, an interesting question just came through to all the panelists were, how open are vendors to one-year deals?
Well, I saw that and smiled, because I think that's the point that Joe was just making is some of them aren't. Just as some vendors many years ago weren't open to you faxing documents. They wanted you to use the mail system. So the question is, you can find vendors who are willing to talk about any of these things that Joe has brought up. And those are the more nimble vendors who are more reflective of current technology. And those are the ones you need to seek out. So if you're talking to a vendor who isn't willing to discuss some of these options, including shorter contracts, then I'd suggest it's time to talk to somebody like Mike and expand your search to other vendors.
It's so interesting, you know, my take on that. It's so funny because we've been in the market now for over 15 years, and our termination clause as a software provider is 3 months. 3 months notice. Do you know how many clients have used it in 15 years? None. None. We've had clients that have merged or have gone out of business or whatever, or have dropped off because large cases ended or whatever. But if you have to tie your business to a contract that forces your client into an unhappy marriage, then you're not in a good place. So I guess that's my renegade perspective on that.
You know, I'll chime in quickly just on that topic, because I'm a big fan of sort of, you know, pay as you go and project-based things. That's a lot of what the work that I do today is very project-oriented. Get involved in a project and stay on that project and then move to the next project. So I'm a big fan of those kind of things, but you don't see that a lot. You know, you've got to buy a long-term software contract, or, you know, get into a long subscription with a provider somewhere, you know, for managed services or something like that. I like the infrastructure service providers as well. And I remembered somebody asked a question about these kind of models, these services out there that kind of compare different, you know, apples to apples pricing arrangements. And I think those are useful and they should be used. I'm reminded of a silly little Latin phrase, you know, it's caveat emptor, the buyer should beware, loosely translated. It's on the buyer to go out and figure out, you know, as we started to talk about, do they understand it? You need to learn this stuff and you need to understand it and be aware of what you're buying. And like Joe said, push back. And I'll be honest, to sort of take the other side for a minute, I know providers out there who will say, you know what, I just can't do it for that price. And they'll pass on the project. Yeah. So it goes both ways. And that's, you know, obviously everyone's free to do that. So that's just something else to keep in mind.
Let me say real quick about that comparison pricing model, though. I've looked at that several times in my pro bono work with federal defenders, because we are obligated when a large case fires up to compare at least 3 different vendors to get pricing for the court, because the court signs off on those projects. I work with attorney Russ Aoki up on Seattle on those projects. And Russ and I know it's easy to say we're going to use comparative models, and then you start looking at the bids that are submitted, and finding the differences in terminology is far easier than finding the apples to apples to apples for comparative purposes. It is a monumental task. I'm not saying it's not a good idea, and if you can get it done, it doesn't have a good result. Very, very difficult. It's
a fair point, Tom, and I totally agree with you. Again, I just advocate having more information. What you do with that information is on you as the buyer.
Yep, I agree.
I think that cynics would say where there's mystery, there's margin, Tom.
I got to remember that one.
Now, I don't know if you can address this, but someone did ask for alternative model specific examples.
Well, I think Joe just gave some, and here's a
Yeah.
couple.
Let me just spend no more than 30 seconds talking about EDT, because this is not about EDT. There are many excellent options out there in the market. I happen to be the founder and CEO of eDT. I'm very proud of what we're doing in the market and have been doing over 15 years. And I'm very excited about our model. I think it's fair. I think it's very affordable. You can sort of drop a zero, at least 1 0, on the prices that people are used to paying in the market. We do not charge per gig. I find it egregious to think that that model still exists, and I will not do it. I've been in situations where we've lost RFPs because we've put a big red line through the whole pricing page and said, here's our model, because we didn't want to work with that model. So one of our models is, and I will say, we just do software. We're not a service provider. We don't host, directly retail. We don't do project management and all that stuff. That's what our partners do. So bring your own infrastructure. BYOI is a very, very popular model that we're seeing in the market. And that is, we offer software licensing. It can be on-premise. It can be in your own cloud. If you want to do your own cloud, knock yourself out. We will install in your cloud. If you want us to do the cloud for you, guess what? We'll bundle it up as a platform, and then we'll add a fair margin onto a transparent AWS cost, plus our license fee. It's totally transparent, and it still ends up being a drop of zero price differential. Floating licenses are also working really well for us. We have a number of global firms that have actually taken on what we call an unlimited global floating license, meaning we don't care how many users, how many gigs, how many instances they've got worldwide. Doesn't matter. But you pay a fixed annual fee, so the predictability, and there's one line item in the annual invoice. If you want to roll it out in any jurisdiction in the world, on any cloud or on your own premises or on a laptop, you either bring your own infrastructure, or we can help you at an hours by rate basis. In fact, our partners do that to set it up. So floating licenses have been hugely successful for us. And data storage thresholds. If people really do want a quote based on volume, then what we'll say is we start at 1 terabyte. And guess what? It's hundreds, not thousands. So we just pass on AWS costs with a small margin and then add the software license on top of it. Now, that doesn't lend itself to traditional hosting models, and that's why we have such a strong partner network, because throughout all of this, there's a very strong partner proposition, and our partners make good profit.
I've got to give you all a heads up.
End of EDT story. Sorry.
I've got to give you all a heads up. We've got 5 minutes left, and we've got several slides to get through, and we've got some questions. So we need to talk really fast.
Well, go ahead, Gail. The question here, I think, was one of proportionality, and does any of this discussion, meet the rule requirements, the federal rule requirements now about proportionality, not spending more than you have to. Let me say real quickly. FRCP 1, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure 1, says that all matters in front of the courts shall be handled by the courts and the litigants in a manner that is just, speedy, and inexpensive. I think just, the first word in that rule, deals with the quality issue. Good quality brings a just result, and the courts look at that. Speedy, of course, is the technology that we talk about. You've got now massive amounts of data, but you've also got great new technology that cuts through that much, much quicker. But the quantity, we've talked about the quantity and charging by the gigabyte, and that, I think, really goes to, is it inexpensive? Just, speedy, and inexpensive. How much quantity is there, and is that price proportional to the cost of the case? In many cases, and one of the people who answered one of our polls made note of this, we used to just ingest everything. And I think this goes back again to the paper days. We used to take all the data that was given to us, all the data that was collected, and just start processing it, throwing it in there, and reviewing it. And my old friend Gene Eames, who's the search expert at a large pharmaceutical company in New York, once pointed out in a web actually a conference that we were attending that's the technology equivalent of boiling the ocean. And we had a little slide about that shows that concept of boiling the ocean now, and then what that was really limited early case assessment. You know, we don't need to boil the ocean. We don't need to take all the data that was preserved. First of all, preservation duty doesn't mean you have an obligation to produce. You have an obligation to look through the data that you've preserved and decide what it is after consultations with your opponent at the meet and confer about what you're going to produce. And so you have ECA, early case assessment. And we've been rather ineffective in culling that initial amount of data. And now we've got better tools to do that. We've got much better tools that will cull down the data. And we've got tools that I mentioned this earlier. You know, we can process, we can input and output. That's one of the comparison problems that we've always had. Joe said, you know, what is a gig? And well, sometimes it's a gig in versus a gig out. That gets extremely confusing. We've got to do a better job of culling and include processing and analytics and TAR and productions all in that one tool that lets us get that big volume of data down to a manageable volume of data. And don't worry about keyword searching, but use the right tool that gives you those analytics and gives you, if you will, some of that TAR that's built in. And that will get you down to a manageable amount of data, which will meet the proportionality requirements, which will be just, speedy, and efficient. And I think that's the real obligation that per gigabyte pricing doesn't meet anymore. And some of these newer tools, like we're seeing with EDT, are able to do for you. And I think, and again, in answer to the question earlier, you need to search out the people who are thinking this way and not thinking about, and there's been several more questions about what do we do when large companies pass that pricing down to everybody. There are plenty of other companies who do not. There are other choices out there, and you can find them. Trust me. So that's what I got. Gail, you know, I know we're running out of time. Can we answer some of those questions for folks?
Sure.
But can we get to them email any that don't get answered?
I'm sorry?
Can we still provide answers to those folks when we run out of time here? Can we get emails to people?
Of course we can.
Good. Okay.
I'll go ahead and start going through some of the questions that were asked, and let me move up to the top. In the beginning of the session, we were asked, can a new pricing model for eDiscovery and lit support provide greater access and opportunity to smaller, lower cost firms, and especially civil plaintiffs firms?
Well, I'll take that if you don't mind. You know, that's a subject that's near and dear to me. I've written a couple of books about eDiscovery for small cases and small firms. And I've had several discussions online recently with Craig Ball, who of course has a background as a plaintiff's attorney. And I think the short answer to that question is yes. These sorts of alternatives that we're talking about are not based on a pricing model that requires large amounts of data up front or overall in the case. You're able to come up with a solution that will be, and again, that's the proportionality that I was referring to earlier, a pricing that will match the value of the case. It's a tough problem, and it's one that it's almost like some of the big companies have backed themselves into a corner. They have large overhead, they have large staffs, they have to feed the machine, if you will, and so they need to have large cases to support all of that. And they're not interested in the smaller cases. These alternatives that Joe pointed out, I think provide that capability for you.
All right, let's get to another one. How important is it to focus on predictive pricing when it comes to quoting clients for eDiscovery services?
Yeah, I think we answered that.
Very.
All right.
It's very, yeah, it's extremely important. And I think, you know.
I think you answered it as well. Are the providers getting more benefits from their data centers? Oh, I already asked that one.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Claralegal? I don't know if you want to go into.
That's the comparison question, Gail.
Okay. I'll move on.
Yeah, I touched on that.
Yeah.
All right. You mentioned that lawyers were not happy that per gig pricing is not value-based. Lawyers charge per hour. That is not value-based as well. I don't understand what hour of lawyer time really gives me, just like they don't understand what gigabit it gives them. But this
Okay.
This is a conversation that needs some red wine and
Yeah.
a lot of time.
It is a slightly different. It's a slightly different conversation, but it's a similar conversation about the value proposition, and I think that's why you're seeing a lot of pushback on the billable hour.
Yeah.
In the industry.
Exactly.
Yep. And then somebody asked for alternative model specific examples. We went through that. Define the, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this word, counting of reviewed documents, please. Do you mean ingested for review? What if the docs are filtered or called away and actually removed from the review platform?
Maybe we respond in email on that one. It looks a little complicated given the time limits we're under. We'll respond.
I've got some experience with that, though. I'll be happy.
Oh, sorry, Tom.
Yeah, no, no. I'll be, we can answer that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll answer that by email.
Yep.
Do you think outsourcing eDiscovery services outside the United States is a good alternative to offer competitive prices?
Oh, it depends. Joe can speak.
Well, if you want to protect your privacy, it might be a good idea.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, ouch.
Ouch.
No, yeah, I mean, shop around. Sometimes there's another question there, Gail, about jurisdictional issues from John Capp. It is important, of course, to make sure you know where your data is being hosted, and there are some scenarios where it's critically important that the data does not leave the jurisdiction. In the EU, where we do a lot of work, it's very, very important that whether it's our partner on their own infrastructure or working with a partner to deliver a cloud-based solution, that cloud offering must have very clear guidelines in terms of where the data resides, and all of the major cloud providers do that now, particularly Azure, AWS, and SoftLayer, the ones that we're very familiar with. They offer that as a standard offering, and it's of critical importance that you work with someone that can offer that.
Okay, and I understand why I didn't know the word counting, because it was supposed to be counting. So,
Thanks, Susan.
hi, Bill. It's good to see you online. He had a quick question, but you have to process to use analytics, so you need to ingest a larger volume? No?
Well, yeah, and that's the point that I think Joe was trying to make, that we shouldn't be charging for processing. So you can
Right.
process all the data you want to look at, then run your analytics as part of that culling down process, and then promote to the review stage. Yes. So you still start with the larger amount. But when you're not getting charged, A, for the processing, and B, for the promoting, and you know, for each and every one of those steps, then you can do that. Also, the speed is incredibly important, of course.
Well, we're about 5 minutes over now. Is there any final little things you guys would like to throw out to wrap this up? Tom?
Well, I just think we clearly, and clearly not just from our presentation, but from the questions, you know, we're having a paradigm shift. It's something that, in another context, Judge Rosenthal in Houston, federal judge, mentioned when she was the chair of the Rules Committee, that we have to have a paradigm shift in how lawyers handle documents in the electronic age. She wasn't talking about this specifically, but I think that's what's going on. We are, in fact, having a paradigm shift about how we should work with these documents. This is not a one-time discussion. I mean, we could repeat this presentation in 3 months and probably have more to add at that point. So
We might have to, since I might have screwed up the recording, so we might have to repeat it.
oh, there you go.
Joe,
Okay.
any final,
Yeah, two comments. I think going back to the beginning, the video. Thanks for playing that favourite video of mine, Gail. It's time to get mad as hell and stop taking it.
There you go.
Just open your window, yell out, "I am mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore." Push back. You do not have to absorb and pass on per gig pricing. And relatively speaking, people, there are alternatives, so hunt them out.
right on.
Excellent.
Michael, any final comments?
Joe just stole everything I was going to say, except I'm not going to open the window. I'm not going to scream out the window.
Oh, you're no fun.
You could actually be a little more demure about it and you know, ask for that transparency. Do your homework. Don't be afraid to investigate. You know, call your colleagues. Find out what others are doing. There's a lot of sort of it's kind of a weird siloed territorialism in this business, and you know, I think it's time to start breaking some of those walls down and really having honest to goodness conversations like the one we had today.
Yep.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for their rapt attendance today. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email me. There are a couple we're going to address via email. If you would like to contact any of the speakers directly, their emails are right there on the screen for you. So feel free to do that as well. And the slides will be available, as well as the recording, if the recording indeed worked out. Just give us a couple days here at EDT to get those up on our website under resources, videos. And our website is discoveredt.com. And again, any questions, feel free to email us all. Email me and I'll get it to the right person. And you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gail.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
You have one last comment, Tom?
Yes. Well, in showing off my background in IT and my concern for backups, I hit the record button on my computer as well. So I think we'll have one.
He's got your back. He's got your back, Gail.
He's the bomb. He's the bomb. Again, thank you everyone for your attendance and have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.